Hello. Uh, Good morning, everyone. On behalf of KRVI, I would like to welcome our today's guest speaker, James Stickley. James is a design principal with WRT, an urban planning and design firm in the US, with a national interdisciplinary practice involving planning, urban design, architecture, and landscape architecture. James is also a board member of the Landscape Architecture Foundation, where he sits on the climate change task force and works with his fellow members to better position the field of landscape architecture to address challenges posed by climate change. As an urban planning and landscape architecture practitioner, James's practice is focused on urban resilience strategies and interventions that span the range of planning, urban design, and site-specific placemaking, and solutions that typically revolve around land use redistribution, green infrastructure, transit-oriented development, mobility, and the creation of socially and ecologically functional public spaces. So, welcome, James. We are very happy to have you here today. So, we'll begin with the talk. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Pataki. So it's such a pleasure to be here. I am one thing. Okay, can everyone hear me? Okay. One thing that Pataki did not mention is I'm on a sabbatical right now. So I've taken a few weeks off from my practice in California, and I'll be 2 months now during this phase of my sabbatical. Then I go back to my practice for a few months, and then next spring I'm going to take another 3 months of sabbatical. And it's a research sabbatical, so it's not all fun, although some of it is fun. But my interest is in looking at urban resiliency thinking and strategies in 4 different regions of the world. And so the first region of my research is Australia, and I've just come from there, and I spent time in Melbourne and Sydney. And my second region is Northwest India, and I just got here on Sunday, so I'm just still getting oriented a little bit, but I'll be in Mumbai for 2 weeks, then I'll be in Pune for 2 weeks, then I'll be in Ahmedabad for 1 week, and then I head back to California. And I'm really asking the same questions in each of these regions, which I'm going to not say now, but I'm going to say at the end. And I hope that this session with all of you is not just me talking. I'm happy to give a little summary of our practice at WRT. But what I'm really more interested in is to hear what all of you are thinking about in terms of what challenges we're dealing with in cities around the world due to climate change, and what resiliency strategies we're developing and implementing to respond to those challenges. So I hope to hear from some of you after I give this brief presentation. So I'll just go ahead. This is my hometown. This is San Francisco, California. And we have an interesting time right now in what we call the Bay Area. It's many communities, 9 counties that surround a large bay. I have a map later in the presentation. San Francisco is one of those communities, but we have many other communities that face the bay, and that is collectively known as the Bay Area. It's about 7 million people that live around the bay, and we try to look at the Bay Area in a holistic way and understand what the challenges are that all of these cities are dealing with. And right now, the conversation is a little bit narrowly focused, I would say, on sea level rise. This is what most people think about when they think of urban resiliency, is how are we going to respond to sea level rise? But we believe in our practice that really sea level rise is only one part of the challenges that we're all facing. Even coastal cities have many other challenges that they're facing due to climate change. And so we're trying to look more holistically at all of those challenges. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. This hill is in the middle of San Francisco. It's called Twin Peaks. And this is a destination from a weekly bike ride that I do. I climb to the top of this hill. It's one of 2 bike rides I do during the week. And it's a great place to look down over the city and over the bay and contemplate these challenges that we have. So our practice, WRT, is about 100-person practice. We're divided into 2 offices, one in San Francisco and one in Philadelphia. And we're divided into 4 practice areas. And this is how we like to think of ourselves, as opposed to the second group, which is 4 disciplines. And I'll explain a little bit about that. So our practice areas have to do with community design, which is mainly the space where I work. It's about urban planning, urban design, and in the case of our practice, the implementation of design and implementation of public space projects. We have housing in neighborhoods, which is a second practice area in which we're looking at affordable housing. It's a huge challenge in the United States right now to have enough housing to house all of our people. We're behind. We're not keeping up with the need. And so we have a whole practice mainly based in Philadelphia that is designing affordable housing. It's largely an architecture practice. The third is parks and open space, which is exactly what it sounds like. And the second is education, which is our practice mainly with university planning and design. So we work with a lot of campuses all around the United States and certainly in California to do master planning, landscape master planning, and then the implementation of campus landscapes. And then the 4 disciplines that we have in our firm are planning, urban design, architecture, and landscape architecture. We do not have an architecture practice in San Francisco. That resides only in Philadelphia, but we have the other 3. And I practice in all 3 of those. I'm trained as a landscape architect, but I wear 3 hats, urban design hat and the planning hat, and I move back and forth between those disciplines as appropriate to address the problem at hand, the project at hand. And that's something that we encourage in our practice. Many people that come to WRT are interested in not residing in their discipline silo, but they're interested in working at different scales and interacting with different disciplines. So we call ourselves an interdisciplinary firm. We used to say multidisciplinary, but that allowed us to work in silos, and we're now trying to break down those silos and work together as disciplines so that we can really be more effective at solving problems. Our practice ethos is rooted in ecological planning, social equity, and community-based planning processes. So engaging with communities is really a mainstay of our practices. All of our work has a level of engagement with community. We think that is the critical piece of success for projects. If we don't understand the issues of community, we can't address them. And no matter how beautiful a design is, if it's not rooted in community culture and community need, it's not going to be successful. So we think that that's really critical part of our practice, and it's something that we take very seriously. This was the founder of the firm, Ian McHarg. He was one of the, I think, at least in the United States, one of the leaders of the environmental movement in the 1960s. And he started the firm with 3 of his grad students, Wallace, Roberts, and Todd, who are the current namesakes of the firm. And he wrote this book, Design with Nature, which really became a guiding force in urban planning about how to approach planning problems with looking through an ecological lens, but also looking through a social lens. We work across scales and professional disciplines, as I said, to create forward-thinking, actionable solutions that meet the unique needs of the communities we serve. And we've been very fortunate to be recognized for our work over the 60 some odd years of practice. I haven't been there for 60 years, but I have been there for 22 or 23 years, and we feel very fortunate that we've been recognized in these different ways. So I'm going to talk about resilient communities and how we view resilience. So WRT views resilience as a holistic approach to the interrelated factors of community health and well-being. This is part of a more timeless challenge to create environments that help communities survive and thrive in the context of change. And I think maybe I should just pause on that. Survive and thrive in the context of change. So we don't know what all the impacts are going to be. We can predict some of them. We know there's going to be flooding issues. We know there's going to be drought issues. We know there's going to be increasing temperatures in the urban landscape, the heat island. But some of the things we can't predict, that we don't know when that random storm might come, what its intensity will be. We can't predict certain economic cycles that are going to heavily impact our community. There are a lot of changes that are happening in the world, and some of those changes and impacts, we just don't know what they're going to be. Some of them we do. And so how can we prepare ourselves to be ready for impacts and ready for change? How can we build strong communities that are adaptable and that are resilient to whatever those impacts might be? So we think of resilience as being made of 5 components. And I have to be honest, 2 weeks into my sabbatical, I am already thinking 5 is not sufficient. So there's some other emerging factors just in the great conversations that I've been having with different people that I'm already thinking, okay, this is more like 6 or maybe 7 factors, but certainly we can talk about that. And I'm curious to hear from you what's missing here. But the 5 that we are focused on are social equity, mobility, ecology, and green infrastructure, which we sort of tied together in sort of an integrated package. It's about what we're learning from nature's systems and how we're bringing those kinds of functions into the urban landscape. That's what we think of as green infrastructure. It's very tied to the ecology of a place. Public health and access to open space and economic vitality. So we believe if communities are paying attention to these 5 things, that they're going to be more resilient to whatever impacts they're going to experience. So our practice helps protect communities from a wide range of impacts, whether they're related to severe weather, wildland fires, which is a huge issue in California right now, long-term sea level rise, changing economies, or that may be social in their root causes. Communities with a strong foundation of these elements are more successful at adapting to change and responding to challenges. So I'm going to go through each of the 5. Please bear with me, and I'm going to give brief examples of some and a little bit longer examples of others that are represented by some of our project work. So social equity, I think this really rises to the top of our practice right now. This is the one issue that we talk most about. How do we make our communities more equitable? How can we make sure everyone is housed? How can we make sure everyone has access to a job? How can we make sure that everyone has services for their family, daycare, access to healthy food, access to parks and whatnot, everyone. And when we start to have inequities in our communities, it leads to many problems. So we think this is really at the root of community success, community well-being, and also at the root of resiliency. Equitable communities are fundamentally more successful across a range of economic, social, and cultural indicators, and ultimately more resilient to a wide range of impacts. Thriving communities have access to education, a diversity of jobs, healthy food, clean air, water, parks, and open space. I'm repeating myself a little bit. From this foundation, communities are ultimately more resilient to a wide range of impacts, both socioeconomic and natural. So I'm showing this. This is one of our projects that we've just finished. It's actually going before the Planning Commission this month, which I'm going to join in remotely for the presentation, and it's going before the City Council of the City of Millbrae in November. And really what this project is about is housing. California has not been good at keeping up with its housing needs. Many communities are NIMBY communities. Do you use that term here in Mumbai? Are people familiar with what NIMBY means? Yeah, not in my backyard. So there's a resistance in many communities across the United States and certainly in California to newcomers, to density, to affordable housing. People don't want their communities to change. They want it to stay the way it is. They want to preserve their character. But in fact, underneath this is a kind of prejudice. And so it's a huge problem, and it has stifled housing growth throughout California to the point where we are way, way behind now in housing our citizens. So very recently, in the last 2-3 years, the state has stepped in and essentially is forcing communities to meet their housing obligations. And so the mandate from the state says, we're not going to tell you how to do it, you figure it out, but if you don't do it, we will step in and we'll do it for you. And so that is sort of using a pretty heavy stick, if you will. They tried the carrots were not working, and so they got out the big stick. And so now all the communities are required to prepare a plan to show where the housing goes. And that's been a lot of our practice over the past few years, is working on these community plans to figure out how we can sensitively integrate housing into the urban fabric. Communities are concerned about their character. They're concerned about density. Does it fit? Is this type of infill compatible with the fabric of our city? And our answer is it certainly can be. And let's work through solutions that are integrated with your community. Let's not put in arbitrary 20-story towers in a low-scale residential area, but let's be sensitive to context. And if we can truly understand any context, we can figure out how to do infill sensitively. And this project is comprised of, it's a linear project. It goes for 2 or 3 miles in each direction. So this is just one small section, but it's comprised of 2 corridors. One is the quote unquote Main Street corridor, which is the historic traditional shopping street, the main street of this community. And the other is a regional corridor that before the highways were built, this was the main arterial that connected north-south through the peninsula, with the whole Bay Area from San Francisco all the way down to San Jose, so 50 or 60 miles. It's called the El Camino Real, and it's really a big commercial strip. And what we are finding in many of the communities along the El Camino Real is there's lots of capacity to be had along this corridor. And the scale of the boulevard is such that a taller mass or a taller building feels proportionate to the scale of the corridor. So this corridor can take relatively more density and more height and still feel human in scale and in proportion. Whereas this corridor is much narrower. There's a much more sensitive historic fabric here, and the infill along here needs to respond to that. So that needs to be, smaller masses, lower densities, etc. But even there is capacity. So there's always capacity somewhere. It's just figuring out how to do that in an artful and sensitive way in each context. This is a project from our Philadelphia office. It's an affordable housing project in a smaller town, Meriden, Connecticut, and it's built near transit. So you have a strong transit link. That's something that's really critical in these density infills. And it's also part of the project was a big public open space, this park that, adds recreational opportunity and health opportunity to the community. This is another affordable housing project in Philadelphia. It's near Temple University, so it has some student housing, but it also has low-income housing. It's also near transit. It's near the university. There are community spaces planned on the ground floor. It's a green building. There's a lot embedded in this project that have, really added quality of life to this community. Second element is ecology and green infrastructure. Ecological systems are the backbone network of Earth's vital functions, ensuring clean air, clean water, carbon sequestration, and the biodiversity that supports all living organisms, including humans. We believe humans are part of ecology, but they have a lot more responsibility. They're the parent, if you will, and they've made a lot of mistakes that have led to ecological degradation. And so now humans need to step up and take responsibility for the damage that's been caused and help bring ecologies back into balance. So we are a part of it, but we need to steward it. We need to take care of it. Green infrastructure solutions seek to narrow the gap between natural ecosystems and engineered infrastructure. So this is the Bay Area. As I said before, San Francisco sits roughly in the middle, Oakland here, San Jose at the south end, Richmond at the north end, but many communities encircling the Bay. And this is where a lot of our work occurs, is in the interface between these blue zones, which are zones that are vulnerable to coastal flooding. And we have another map that I need to replace this one with, which is the zones that are vulnerable to wildland fire, which are coming from the uplands down towards the shoreline. And then the coastal floodings from the shoreline inward. And sometimes, those are interacting with each other. The yellow zones are economically vulnerable communities. So these are communities that have socioeconomic issues and challenges, and there tend to be a lot of overlap between those vulnerable communities with areas of risk. And that's really kind of the sweet spot, if you will, for our practice. And so these are just a number of the projects that we're working on around the Bay in this interface zone between vulnerability and risk. And just a couple of examples. First, just to address coastal adaptation, which again is only one part of resiliency, but it's certainly an area of concern in the Bay Area. A way that a lot of folks are thinking about coastal resiliency is that there are these three tools that we can use to protect ourselves from coastal flooding and from sea level rise. One is retreat, just pull land uses back that are vulnerable to those impacts, pull them back to higher ground. Another is protect, so build a barrier that will protect from flooding, like a levee, or protect from sea level rise, like a seawall. And then the third is adapt. What can we do to sort of change the interface of the shoreline to the communities in order to be more integrated with natural processes, whether they be flooding that happens in wetlands or giving more space for sea level rise to happen. And we're really using all three of these, and oftentimes we're using a combination of two or all three in any given project. So this is a project north of San Francisco in Marin County, the community of Mill Valley. And here we have a channelized creek that was engineered decades ago. And what is happening now with sea level rise and flooding is that the shoreline here in this wetland has lost its ability to adapt naturally to those natural processes. There's a process of sedimentation and accumulation where if you allow nature to do its own thing, which includes the transport of sediment from upland areas that can come down into a marsh and continually build it up according to where the tide levels are, then nature can sort of adapt as the world changes, as sea level rise happens. But by channelizing that creek, we're not allowing that to happen. So part of our project here is to dechannelize this creek and to allow this area to go back to its natural state where it can start that sedimentation process more effectively. This is another project. This is a second campus for UC Berkeley, which is one of the big universities in the Bay Area. And this campus is in the North Bay in Richmond. You can see San Francisco here in the distance, the Bay Bridge, the Golden Gate Bridge, some things that people might recognize from either being there or from photographs. But our approach here for this project is really more about the adaptation. So in those three bubbles that I talked about before, this was really looking at the coastal ecologies and looking at a way to weave them into the campus plan and actually make an interpretation of those wetlands and their functions as part of the campus open space. So really, embracing that adaptation strategy, not trying to block it or build a barrier, but just saying, no, there are going to be some tidal forces and some hydrologies that is going to want to ebb back and flow, and we want to make that a part of this campus landscape. And then this one, I'll spend a little more time on. This is Microsoft's new Bay Area campus. Microsoft is based in Redmond, Washington, and they have a huge campus there, but it's quite a large tech company, as I'm sure many of you have heard, and Bay Area has, a lot of the who's who of tech companies like Google, like Facebook, and so on. And so Microsoft felt the need to be equal in prominence and wanted a campus that sort of conveyed their philosophy as a firm and their approach towards their employees. And a lot of what's happening in the Bay Area at these tech campuses right now is that there's a competition for workers. And so campuses are quite nice. It makes me wish I had gone into tech instead of urban planning. They get free lunches from the campus cafeteria. They have, gyms. They have all these outdoor recreation opportunities, and they have great collaborative spaces, which are these collective studios, but that can also be integrated with outdoor spaces. So with that as a goal, we were part of a team that came in and designed this new campus. And one of the big forces here was to really integrate ecology into this campus. So this is a creek corridor that exists, and it goes right out to the bay. The bay is quite close by. And the overall concept here was to bring the different zones of ecology from this creek inward to the campus, including on this green roof, which is about a 4.5 acre, so what is that, 2 point something hectare green roof that is part of that ecological landscape for the campus. And then there was a lot of other strategies to the design in terms of creating social space and creating collaborative space, but the ecological thread was really sort of the driving force for this. And there was a lot of very high performance goals that were set for this project. Microsoft essentially said, we want to be great. How do we do that? And our team said, well, if you're serious, you want to have net zero water use, you want to have create your own energy, you want to treat your own sewage, all of these things. And they said, okay, let's do it. And so our team then had to figure out how to do all those things. So this is the campus where it sits. It's in the middle of Silicon Valley. It's close to the Bay Edge. So we're looking at it in context with the surrounding urban growth, but we're also looking at it in context with the South Bay ecology. And to do that, we said, okay, what was that South Bay ecology made of? How did that function historically? And it went from tidal flats to tidal marshes, to wet meadows, to willow areas, and ultimately to uplands where the oak forest grows. And so we tried to understand how taking that historic ecology with all of those different elevations, if you will, which each have a different hydrology and work their way up to this upland condition, how that plays out in terms of the topography, in terms of the different ecologies that happen and the different hydrological functions at those different levels. And what were the benefits that were given by those ecological systems? And then we looked at what happened in the 1960s, which was put impermeable parking lots around low-rise office buildings, the loss of green space, the loss of ecological zones, the loss of natural hydrologies. And we really lost so much there that used to be produced by those ecologies. And so our concept for the campus was to bring as many of those ecologies back into the campus plan as possible. So we did away with surface parking lots. We gathered development up into more compact masses, and then we introduced those different ecosystem types to the different areas of campus. And we tried to regain as many of these functions in terms of sequestering carbon and absorbing water and so forth as was possible. Perhaps not to the original state, but as much as we could, given the development context that we were working with. So these are what we're calling the ecosystem services that we're trying to achieve, that the natural landscape can provide. And we really looked at each one of those very diligently as a layer of the plan. So how do we get an impact of air quality? How can we respond to some extreme events like big storms? How can we provide a richness of habitat? Can we grow food on the campus? Can we conserve water? Can we attract pollinators? And so each one of those was looked as a separate layer and built into the landscape plan for the campus. And the result was a campus that is surrounded by a very sort of rough, rustic, natural landscape. And then the inner landscape is more about the social spaces where people really want to concentrate for their outdoor activities, and then the roof itself. So one can circulate on the roof to go down into any workspace the same as they can circulating on the ground floor. So there's this duality of function, the use of the green roof, but also the introduction of two of the 5 or so ecologies that we're creating onto the green roof. So the species were very, carefully selected to create that ecology. The next element is mobility. So mobility is what connects us all to the things that we need to lead healthy and fulfilling lives. Circulation networks ensure that our homes are efficiently connected to our jobs, to recreation, to food supply, to vital services, and to cultural experiences. In a resilient community, mobility networks emphasize active transportation, so walking and cycling, and transit, that all together that minimize the carbon footprint of our transportation systems. So I'm just going to give one example of that. This is a large project that we've been involved with for probably almost 20 years. It's very complicated. It's a brownfield site. So it was a sanitary landfill for a number of years in this part of the site, and then it was also a rail yards before that. The entire project is reclaimed land, so it used to be part of the bay before they built the rail yards in the early 1900s, and then later in the 1930s, I believe, they added the sanitary landfill, which was really the garbage dump for the city. So those are the conditions that we had to work with. We developed a plan for this, which is now gone through the environmental review process. The upshot of the plan is there can be no residential uses on the former sanitary landfill, but we can have residential uses on the former rail yards in this part of the site. And I'll just explain, maybe this way is better. So the plan is really looking at the different layers that influence the plan. So what are the districts and land uses? What is the transit network? What are the parks and open space systems? Key alignments are sort of historic alignments, but also main mobility corridors. And then the landform and the drainage, which is very complicated because of the historic brownfield conditions, and then these historic alignments like the old rail yards. And how do we consider all of these as a way to form the plan as it is? And one thing that I wanted to stress in particular is that the transit networks, both existing and planned, were really a driving force for this plan. So the northern part of the site is transit rich. There's an existing commuter train line that goes through here that connects the whole peninsula, and it has a station that exists on this undeveloped site. And then there is a new BRT, bus rapid transit, that's going to be developed here, going back to our commuter rail. And then there's a city streetcar that comes down from San Francisco that terminates at this site and that eventually will come into this site. So where all of those come together is a perfect place for density. So we can have a strong relationship of transit to housing, transit to jobs. And so that was really the driving force behind the plan. A street network then was built around that. And then a strong bicycle and pedestrian framework was built around that. So really trying to keep all of those different types of mobility in balance with each other. And those are serving the land uses, which are much higher density in the north. This is where the transit village would occur with high residential density, and then decreasing densities as we go south with tech campus sites here in the southern area, but also increasing open space as we go south, which can be used for ecological restoration, for recreation, etc. So that was the final plan, as I showed before. And then this is a view of in the transit village to the north, so different transportation threads coming together in a higher density development that includes residential and commercial mixed use. Public health and open space access. So creating environments where people can be assured of clean air, clean water, access to healthy food, open space, and exercise, as well as vital support services, will ensure socially and economically vital communities. So this is a park project in the center of San Francisco, actually in a new development area called Mission Bay. This is another brownfield site closer to our urban core. And it's another site that was used as a rail yards after the 1906 earthquake. So the rubble from all the earthquake damage was placed in this area, and this area was reclaimed using that rubble as fill. So again, a legacy site, lots of brownfield issues, but also settlement. But it's been the subject of a major redevelopment over the last 20 years, which is essentially finished right now. And our park project sat right at the bottom of this big new development called Mission Bay, but it also served these existing neighborhoods, Potrero Hill and Dogpatch. And so we really worked with all three of these communities. This community didn't exist except for some of the large institutional tenants, but these communities were very well established, and they were all at the table to influence the plan of what they needed in terms of a park in their neighborhood. So these were some of the influences. This was the railroad history of the site, including an engine roundhouse and turntable. And then there was also an ecological history to the site when this was part of the bay. So we really tried to take both of those, the man-made history and the ecological history, and meld those together to create this plan. So there's a big ecological component, mainly in this surrounding zone here. This is all habitat, and it's geared towards an endangered butterfly species. So that was sort of the driver in terms of the landscape. And then there's a lot of social functions that happen in the multi-use lawn, that happen in these little walkways in a sensory garden, and then the main plaza here, which was patterned after the old roundhouse. Another interesting part of this project is we had unlimited fill at our disposal because they were trying to get rid of earth from other parts of the development. So we were able to use that fill to build up, create interesting landforms, but also use it to buffer the nearby freeway on one end of the site. This is the park in an aerial view, and then this is the park as it is today. This is probably 2 or 3 years ago, so it continues to mature, and it continues to get a lot of use from these 3 different communities. This is one of the initial renderings of the park, and then this is the completed park with the butterfly habitat encircling these 2 edges of the park. Social space, and then lastly, economic vitality. Economic vitality provides the financial lifeline of a community, creating a diverse business economic ecosystem that spans the spectrum of small local businesses to large, stable employers, provides safeguards against the ups and downs of economic cycles, and is more resilient to a wide range of impacts. So the last project I just wanted to touch on is Castro Valley, which is a community in the East Bay. And we developed with the community a strategic plan for this community. Essentially, they were an unincorporated town that had no center, no main street. So they wanted to create a main street. They wanted to create a downtown that they could identify with, that could be their gathering place, the place where they go for shopping, for dining, etc. And before we worked on the project, it was really just a large commercial strip with no center. And so we first developed an idea of infill, of creating opportunities for economic development in these three different zones. And one of them was a little shopping, a village district. Another was an entertainment or a theater district. And the other was a cultural or the library district. And each one of these had very careful study in terms of how we could sensitively do infill that could be brought to the street edge to create an active and inviting edge to the future Main Street. And that was done in all three of these districts. And then to tie all of that together was a pretty radical redesign of the street itself, narrowing the vehicular lanes, expanding pedestrian and expanding bicycle facilities and transit facilities. So this is just a little diagram that shows all of the changes. So widening of sidewalks, the incorporation of bike lanes on both sides, the incorporation of transit stops, which you can't really see in this view, but they are incorporated throughout the corridor. And then a whole regime of green infrastructure, which included permeable paving, stormwater management, rain gardens, and a continuous tree strip with continuous soil along the length of the tree strip. And this was really one of the first projects where we really looked into a lot more the science of what trees need to be healthy long term, and really created conditions here that have been quite successful. So this is some of the stormwater management facilities. You can see in these views that this was actually fairly soon after the project was built, but that was more than 10 years ago. But if you go back there now, these trees have all gotten very large. They form a great canopy over the sidewalk. And moreover, there's been a lot of new social and commercial activity that has been attracted to the edges of the corridor. And part of that is from the design of the social spaces that were part of our work. But another important part of it is how private initiative has stepped forward. Because of the public space improvements, private initiative has come forward and they've invested their own money into creating places like this. So this was an old billiards hall. It was vacant, and it was turned into a food hall with all different purveyors from local food businesses. And then this whole alley was also redone as part of the private initiative. And this has really become a very successful central gathering place for the community right at this time. So it's been really successful in that way. So that concludes my presentation. I just wanted to say that we are collaborators. In order for our work to be successful, it requires partnering with a broad range of disciplines. We engage our partners for their critical expertise in areas such as hydrology, engineering, ecology, architecture, don't forget that, transportation, and economics. And we look forward to continuing dialogue in this exciting quest to create more resilient communities. Thank you. And I wanted to, I don't know how my text got messed up like that, but I wanted to sort of leave everyone with 3 questions and maybe seed the discussion for afterwards. So what impacts are you experiencing in your region caused by climate change? What are the resilient strategies being developed and tested to address those impacts? And what implementation strategies have been most successful in moving them forward? So it's not only what is the strategy, but how does it get implemented? How does it move through the political structure, the financial structure to actually become an implemented project? And then lastly, which projects or initiatives represent your region's best practices for addressing climate change? So thank you all very much.
Thank you so much, James. It was really very interesting to see the application of your practice across different scales, which started right from even street furniture to the scale of urban planning, which was very interesting to see. And it's very nice to see that how you've also brought in the conversation of transformation or transformation, practicing transformation to create resilience amongst the communities and how adaptation can be seen in those lines, which also talks about social equity and ecology, even economy as a discourse, which was very interesting to see that. Thank you so much for your presentation. Any questions that we would like to take up?
Yes, it doesn't have to be a question. Just an idea about successful strategies.
Okay. Oh, you will have to stand here. Okay. You need to be seen in this, I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
In cities in the global south, we are tied with a different kind of social structure altogether, and we have a different we have a sense of intangible heritage as we call. What is your opinion of having intangible heritage as an element in resilience? Or intangible heritage in case not the cultural part of it, but the part that we don't see, the things that we can't measure, which shapes a community, which shapes a society. What about that as an element for resilience towards communities and towards cities?
Well, that's such a great question. Intangible heritage could be so many things. And I think what we try to do through our community engagement is to understand what that intangible heritage is for that community, make it tangible, if you will, by bringing it out through the dialogues with the community. Because there is a heritage in each place. And in order for our work to be relevant, it needs to reflect that heritage. So that's what I would say in a very general way. And it gets back to the importance of community engagement in all of our work. It's not about us are the designers coming and telling people what they should have in their community. It's more about, we are your implementers, if you will. Tell us what it is that your community needs and what needs to be implemented. So there's definitely an attitude that component that is important. It didn't always used to be that way. If you look at the the grand ateliers in European heritage, it was about, I'm the designer, I know best, I'm going to exert my will onto the landscape, and that will be a monument to me. And it doesn't work that way anymore. And I think there were vestiges of that attitude even when I started in the profession 40 years ago. And we have slowly turned that around to, we're really just a mouthpiece or a tool of the community to implement what they need as a community. I would say that to look at the other side of the coin, I think there is an art that we can bring to our work. There's a term we use in our profession called design by committee, which it's a derogatory term. It means that everyone has had input. You've taken all the little inputs from everyone and you've put it into a design, and what you got is kind of a mess, right? So as designers, part of what we can bring is to bring all those threads together in an artful way. and really transcend all of the dialogue and create something that people get very excited about. And I think that's the tricky part, maybe the opportunity, is to bring our art, but to always have that art be a reflection of the true needs of the community. This is a long answer, but you asked such a great question. One of the things that I thought about with your question in terms of intangible heritage is the native heritages that we have in all societies. But in America, we have not been very good about reflecting the native heritage, the Native Americans. And that's something that we are having increasing awareness about now, but we're behind. And other countries, other cultures are doing this much better than we are in America. Our neighbors to the north, in Canada, are ahead of us. I learned a lot from my time in Australia just before coming here. They're ahead of us. They are really recognizing the Aboriginal heritage as a driving force in how they think about a lot of issues. But as it relates to urban planners and as it relates to resiliency, those ancient cultures were all about resiliency. You know, they had learned to live in balance with the land. And so if we can understand what those heritages represented, how they lived, how they respected nature and integrated that into their lifestyles, I think there's a lot that we can bring into our, even into the urban context. So that's just another thought that came to mind. It's a great question. Any other thoughts or ideas? What do some of you think are the most difficult challenges that we're dealing with in our cities right now? And where do you find the most hope for resiliency strategies that will help us address those challenges? Love to hear from you, but I'll also answer questions if I must.
Yeah, thanks for the presentation. Very interesting, especially the section that you showed, how we kind of go through the readaptive cycle. Very interesting for us. It's not a question, but as we have shared our book recently, we worked on resilience. We have Jimmy, who is a faculty, also contributed a chapter in that book. The larger problems I think we have is that we are at very nascent stage in understanding what is climate change, because climate change is not visible. The impact that we see maybe at the longer term, and by the time you realize the damage is already done. The climate change understanding is at very nascent stage, so is the resilience. And whatever understanding of sustainability that we talk is coming from the West. The discourse is almost taken as a prescription. And it's not taken as how do you really appropriate SDGs, how do you appropriate understanding of resiliency, or what are the impacts of climate change on our cities, our people, how do we really, his question is actually embedded into that. How do we really look at various kinds of heritage? Because most of the cities are historic cities. So this is a larger problem that we face, and most of the schools across India looking at more in a prescriptive manner, and rather than kind of a look at the terms and appropriate it in our own geography.
Some really great points. Couple of things come to mind. One is that there are two parts of addressing climate change. One is adapting to the change that we see, and then the other is mitigating the causes of climate change. And I'm sure this is something that you've all talked about. It's sort of a very prominent discussion in our industry. And I think what is challenging is that the general populace can relate to adapting to conditions that they can see. They see stronger storms. They can support the idea of putting in stormwater management and stormwater protection. There's a direct connection. The other side of it, the mitigation side, is much harder to use the term sell, but to convince people to do the right thing. So, you know, for example, the right thing is to go to all, you know, electric energy over fossil fuel, including in our transportation systems. But the reasons for that are much more intangible. And I think it's much harder to convince, you know, the general populace to buy into strategies that are about something that they can't see. So that's just another challenge. The other thought that came to mind from your reflections is that there is so much we don't understand about climate change. You know, it's an evolving science. We're all learning as professionals. The populace is learning. And I think one reflection I've had, you know, stepping away from my practice, even just for a few weeks, has already been really good because I have time to think. And that's so nice to have. It's such a luxury. But one thing that struck me in Australia was the degree to which they're investing in infrastructure. And I think what is important for me, and I'm seeing this in Mumbai as well, there's a massive amount of infrastructure construction happening in the city. And I think that's what we all must do in cities, is to continually renew our infrastructure. And each time we renew it, nothing is permanent. You know, even a project we built today, it's going to be obsolete in a number of decades, maybe 2, maybe 5, it depends. And that's the natural cycle of things. Infrastructure is renewed, technology advances, conditions advance, community needs advance, and each time we renew our infrastructure, we need to reflect all of those current conditions, and in addition to what we can predict. And so I think the important thing, what I've been thinking about is the important thing is not that we get it perfect for this project, but that we just keep renewing. And I think public investment becomes very key in that renewal process. And I'm seeing much more easy flow of public resources in Australia. Here, I'm not sure. I just don't know enough about it yet. But in Australia, a much more free-flowing public funding for infrastructure projects than we have in the United States. We're very constrained. You know, we've got this heavy influence of the Conservative Party in the United States, which actually restricts public investment. We're having some little successes right now in our current administration. I'm very hopeful about that. But I think for cities to adapt well, they really need to embrace investment in public infrastructure and just keep renewing. Other thoughts? Yep.
Okay, so yeah.
Yeah, there you go.
So when we're talking about architecture and urban planning in terms of resilience, I think one major thing I've noticed is that urban planning is largely removed from the shackles of aesthetics that architecture is still held back by,
because a lot of times I think even the aesthetics play into how design really functions over certain aspects to some degree. Obviously, it depends from project to project, but there are some. So, have you noticed something where there has been a sort of conflict between aesthetics versus resilience? Because a major problem in this city has been the whole glass box aesthetic of buildings, where in the West it may work out, but or may not. But here it's been a drastic sort of failure with how the heat works. So have aesthetics and resilient design sort of been at odds, or is it sort of changing?
Yeah, great question. And uh, it's a debate that is happening a lot in our profession. I see it in landscape architecture, I see it in architecture, and also to a degree in planning and urban design. I would say that the choice between resiliency and aesthetics is a false choice. But I think people have made it a question of either or. And I think it's not. I think good designers design with the influences at hand, right? And one of the big influences at hand right now is that we need to create more resilient buildings, we need to make more resilient landscapes, and we need to make more resilient infrastructure. And those that mandate, if you will, to be more resilient is a design factor, and it will create different design opportunities, right? Different aesthetics. And I think that's where the fun can come in, is that, wow, what is that? What is the aesthetics of green? And it's an important movement, if you will, in design, just as we move from classical and postmodernism into modernism. Each of those had a shifting aesthetic, and it came from shifts in technology, shifts in materiality, how structures are built, from load bearing, masonry, to structures that were supported with structural frames that were anchored into the ground and not bearing, upon the ground. That created a different aesthetic, and it became a thing of beauty for those designers that truly embraced it and that looked creatively at how to shape those buildings. So I think that's our challenge, is to, keep aesthetics in mind. That's the opportunity of art, in all that we do. And I think we're all have that artistic side to our obligation, as well as the obligation of being more resilient, more sustainable, more green. Yeah.
Well, it's not a question, but like a comment. I think the problem is that we approach everything at a city level rather than a regional level, where all the consumption or all the accumulation happens in these huge metropolitan cities, which are supported by these 2-tier, 3-tier cities. So the idea of sharing of resources, I think, lacks a lot in India, which could contribute towards resiliency. That's what we can.
Yeah, it's a great point. And I think that we all need to be able to think at different scales. And I think we all need to continuously zoom out, zoom in, zoom out, zoom in, because each time we do that, there is an influence that may not have been seen if we're only working at one scale. So if we're never considering the region and we're just designing our little district, but all of a sudden there's a regional need to have a transit network or a green networks those can influence the district, right? And so we have to understand that, and then we have to reflect that. At the same time, when we're working as a regional scale, we can tend to lose connection to reality of, well, what is really practical to get designed and to get built, because what we're drawing at a regional scale needs to be able to work. It needs to be able to be implemented, at a local level. So I think by working at that zoomed in scale, we understand what those practicalities are. And then when we're thinking in the regional scale, we can apply those practicalities so that those policies and those moves at the regional scale are, have a great chance for success because they're really rooted in reality. So, one thing that I love about our practice is why I think I finally, after working at 2 other firms, I landed on the right place for me, is that we can move across between those scales, and that's encouraged in our practice. And it's important just for the reasons you said.
Thank you so much. This was a very interesting and stimulating conversation. Uh, Thank you for your time, James. It was really nice of you to come here and present your work, which was very helpful for the students. And yes, thank you so much. Please, I would request everybody to applaud James for that. Thank you so much.
You are.